Hello, everyone. Rick Albert here with another great episode of the Key to the City of Angels. Today, I'm very excited to have Grant Burwash of FrontLobby, and we're going to talk about this Assembly Bill 2747. So, Grant, thank you so much for hopping on.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, why don't you kind of give us a high-level view of what this bill's all about?
Sure. So this bill, it goes into effect on April 1st, and it applies to certain housing providers in California. And the whole idea behind it is that it's wanting to promote financial wellness for individuals by allowing positive rent reporting to be applied to their credit file. Now, this is not new, like certain companies have been doing this for a while, but the idea with this bill is to bring more awareness to the fact that rental payments can go on credit files. And for a lot of individuals, rent is, of course, their largest expense that they have every single month. And so by having that payment reflected on their credit file, it can have a significant impact on the credit file within a very short time. Um, for example, with us, we did a study with Equifax a few years ago, and what we've seen from our data is an individual that's relatively new to credit or is starting kind of from a lower standpoint. I mean, you can see 30 to 80 plus points improvement in 6 months of reporting.
Mhm.
So someone that is new to country, new to credit, that could be a student that's getting into housing or anything like that, just an individual, like having their rental payments on a credit file can be really impactful for their financial well-being, considering that's visible to all creditors throughout the next several years.
Yeah, when I've always talked to credit with investors because oftentimes housing providers, landlords, whatever you want to call them today, say like, okay, I had to have a minimum score of like 700, 715. And what I learned is like, I don't have a set number. Now,
Hmm.
with all these laws changing, I might have to, but in the past, I was like, I don't really care as much about the number as I did the history.
Right.
Because one of my previous tenants, not too long ago, had a credit score of like 600, but it's because he was like 21. He was
Yeah.
like a baby. Like he just didn't have he didn't he didn't put himself into debt. Oh no, he's financially responsible. Like
Yeah.
versus someone that might be at 700, but then they might have had late payments and they've had all those things.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I've been promoting this idea for a while to my people. It's like, just like, why couldn't we? It just holds everybody accountable, especially on the tenant side, if they're not paying rent. It's like, okay, but there's consequences outside of, being evicted and all of that. Now, you said
Of
that
course.
now this doesn't apply to all rental properties, right?
That's right. That's right. So this bill isn't sweeping, meaning it won't apply to everybody, but it mandates that if you have a building with over 15 units,
Mm,
or if you have multiple units and you're a corporation, LLC, where at least one member is a corporation, or you are a REIT, like you have to abide
mhm.
by this. So, probably for a lot of your investors or individuals that are listening to this podcast, it's not necessarily going to be mandated for you, but the benefits of reporting both on-time payments and debts do apply, regardless of how many units you have. As you alluded to before, it helps keep people accountable. It significantly reduces any sort of delinquencies and really helps you attract those great tenants that are interested in building their credit up or really care about that financial well-being and say, hey, I can actually have a couple grand a month that goes to my credit file showing as a positive payment. That's really important.
Yeah, no, I agree. Um, so, and then who typically, I guess, I haven't had a chance to review the bill. Does it matter who pays for that service?
No, it
I mean, the
does
tenant
allow.
ultimately pays one way or another, but
Yeah, I mean, you have different ways, different platforms are going to treat it in different ways, but like, and
Mhm.
ultimately the bill allows you as the landlord or the property manager, if you're using one of those, you can pass the cost of reporting onto the tenant. So
Okay.
it is an opt-in from a positive standpoint. So the unique thing about this bill is it allows tenants to opt in as well as opt out. So if they choose to have reporting for a year and then say, hey, I don't want to report anymore, they can just stop paying for it and choose to opt out, and then they can't go back in for 6 months. Like, so there's some weird nuances to the bill that are kind of slightly different from what you hear
Hmm.
from regular contracts or regular
Yeah.
reporting with the credit bureaus. But the whole idea behind it is really to bring to light the fact that rental payments can be used to improve financial well-being.
Yeah.
Now, for us as a company, like we really believe that, you know, all sizes of housing providers should be reporting both positive and negative rental payments to the credit
Hmm.
bureaus. And the purpose of that is when you're looking to screen a potential applicant, like you mentioned, or someone's going for an auto loan or a credit card, like any future creditor wants to see the actual history of whether that
Hmm.
individual, paid their phone bill or paid their rent amount. And the thing with the rental industry is like often reference checks for individuals that haven't had a good history of paying rent are fraudulent. Like they're like, oh, call my brother, or some other
You beat
situation where
me
you're not.
to it. Yeah.
Yeah, you're not able to get the actual information that you want. And so the ability to have that history of the rental payment on a credit file is really important, especially to support the housing industry where you're putting hundreds of thousands of dollars or a multi-million dollar asset in the hand of somebody else and hoping they pay you every single month.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up because we used to do, oh, we need one landlord reference. Now we do two because the previous one does, like, the first one has incentive to potentially lie, right?
Right.
They're great tenants because they want them out,
Right.
right? But the previous one after that is like, well, they're not living at my place anymore. I don't have any skill, like I can tell the truth, so to speak. So in
Right.
this particular case, I wonder if, like, you don't even outside of, like, did they trash the place? Were they great tenants? But from a payment perspective, this is your proof.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. And the other thing is that if you're the individual that's reporting on the tenant that isn't paying you rent,
Hmm.
there's it often takes a while to get any sort of judgment or go through the landlord tenancy branches,
Hmm.
tribunals. It varies by state and jurisdiction what they call it, but it allows you to actually put pressure on that individual to make sure that you're
Yeah.
getting paid, because it ultimately may impact their ability to find other housing, get a car loan, or those
Hmm.
sorts of things. But you can still be going through that eviction process to make sure that you do end up getting them out, and that you end up being kind of top of the list in order to get paid. So I know we're talking a lot of the negative side of it, whereas the bill's focusing on the
Sure.
positive. But the reality is that for smaller housing providers, like if someone doesn't pay them rent for a month or two, it's devastating, right?
Yeah.
They have to tap into personal savings, lines of credit, whatever that is, to cover the mortgage, and that really impacts the housing supply and in many different ways.
Oh, sure. And even as you get older, there was always a joke with my dad where he's like, "Yeah, I have really bad credit." I'm like, "Dad, you're a CPA. How do you have bad credit?" He's like, "I don't have any debt."
Yeah.
So he owned his place, but they would rent temporarily in Berkeley, right up in the Bay
Okay.
Area. And he's like, I mean, they got it done. They rented a small place just because they would go there on the weekends. But he's like, yeah, I had to explain that I don't have debt, therefore my credit score is not that great. You just don't think about it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. And I mean, for me, I've been in a situation where I've owned homes and been renting somewhere else. And it just, life is funny that way. I've moved back and forth between Canada and the US. And so I've had to build up credit. And, it's using rental payments. I can speak from experience. It's really helps you get a good credit fairly quick, right? Without taking debt. I mean, you're already paying it. So
Right.
there's nothing new. It's kind of like your cell phone in many ways. Like you're going to have a cell phone, and cell phones industry has long been reporting to the credit bureaus. It's just relatively new in the rental space.
Out of curiosity, why do you think it took so long to be adopted?
Yeah, I mean, we were the first company in Canada that did this, and we were one of the
Hmm.
early entrants into the US. And what I can tell you is that when you look at historical data that comes in, so think of mortgages and telcos, like
Hmm.
one, there's very few carriers that are reporting the data into the credit bureaus.
Hmm.
And you have an easy contracting phase where when you go to the bank or mortgage broker and sign up, like you sign the contract, you provide consent for reporting. And remind me, I'll get back to consent in a second. But and then most of that goes through a bank or some sort of thing, or your T-Mobile is reporting that to the credit bureaus. So there's very few people that are actually feeding vast amounts of data into the credit bureaus, and therefore it
Hmm.
just becomes an industry standard. With housing, historically 50%, now I think it's kind of into the high 40s of rental properties are offered by smaller independents. And so
Hmm.
going to you, to me, to like the millions of other small, we'll call them mums and pops that are renting to people, it's really hard to capture that data, systematize it in kind of a standard manner, and report it to the credit bureaus in a way that they accept it. Way easier when you look at, a large REIT or, massive property owners that have hundreds of thousands of units. Like, they've got data in one central place that's standardized. And so that
Mhm.
data has been able to be reported for a little bit longer. But, our company was designed to basically take someone that has one unit and provide you with the same benefit of reporting all that rental data to the credit bureaus, just like if you had a million units or you were a mortgage broker.
So then I guess the next question was, how does it get reported? Is it like they have to make the payment through a service like yours? And then that way, and then it goes to the owner? Otherwise, how
Yeah,
would you know?
Yeah, so we set ours up to be agnostic of what other technology you use. So what that means is you don't actually pay through FrontLobby. It basically creates a lease ledger every single month. So you sign up as a housing provider, you verify your identity or your role as a housing provider to ensure that data is not contributed anonymously. So you
Hmm.
can't have people to just be vindictive. Of course, it's very important that you have these
Right,
protections. Yeah.
that was kind of where I was getting at. It's like I just don't want someone to do something they shouldn't be doing.
Right. And so when you're creating that account, you verify your ID, then you create a lease ledger that the tenant can see. So meaning you'd have basic information on the tenant, your rental property details, the rent amount, the tenant's name, and their date of birth. You can add a social security number if you have it, but it's not necessary for reporting. Each month, our system assumes that rent is paid unless you mark it differently. So
Got it.
if I don't pay my rent, you can mark it as being unpaid. That can trigger late payment notices and things that go through our platform. As long as I pay by the end of the month, I'm not going to have that debt that's reported to the credit bureaus. If I don't pay, of course, then that debt can get reported to the credit bureaus.
Got it. So basically, the housing provider has to go in and say payments were not made.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. We try and make it super simple. So,
Sure.
most tenants are going to pay every single month. And, you know, for those that don't, you want to kind of have some active involvement. So it's like, okay, Rick didn't pay. I'm going to
Hmm.
update this balance. Then he paid half of it. So I'm going to make sure that's accurately updated. And then that information can be reported. And the big thing about that is we have a lot of protections that are built into our software. So one being that if an individual wants to use their credit or their rental payments to improve their credit, as is outlined in the bill that we were talking about, like, they
Hmm.
have to actually verify their ID and then opt in through the platform. And what
Hmm.
that does is just helps make sure there's a lot of transparency around the reporting. They can see the information that's going in. They have to actively provide consent for it. However, if there is a debt, consent is never required. And so that's where the protection comes in for the housing provider, that if an individual maybe gives you a wrong email address, or they're not going to provide consent, that's not a problem. Like, you can still report the debts from your current or former tenants to the credit bureaus, and consent is never required for that.
So the consent, so if I'm a tenant, I get the lease and say, okay, by the way, you can opt into this service because I legally have to give you that option. You have to pay for it. Like
Yeah,
that's an option. Um, but they can't necessarily force you to do it, right? I can't be like, you have to do this. Or is that
right.
just a business decision at that point? If that makes sense. I know you're not an attorney, so like we're all good.
Yeah. I mean, in this bill, it explicitly states that it's opt in and opt out. So the tenant
Got
can
it.
choose when they want their positive reporting and when they don't.
Okay.
Legally speaking, like, not legal advice, etc.
Correct.
However, you consent isn't ever required to report a debt in any state in the US.
Oh,
So,
so I could report it anyways.
anyways, that's right. So I can be
Oh,
offering
okay.
this to you, Rick. You can choose to benefit from the positive side or not. However, if you ever go into
Mhm.
default, your negative payments are getting reported anyways. And so, that's where we talk about having kind of a balanced system where the great tenants can choose to benefit from it, but you as a housing provider can always have the benefit of knowing that debts would get reported. And it provides that kind of near immediate incentive for an individual
Mhm.
to make sure those payments are made.
Got it. That makes sense. So really it's not so much of consent of the reporting as much as consent for the positive reporting.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah.
Got it. Have you seen whether it's in Canada or here or wherever, have you seen like most tenants have been, I guess it's hard to determine, but like have you seen uptick in people signing up? Not just because of what's legally required, just in terms of just in general.
Definitely we have. We had a lot of a lot of interest that came through COVID as far as,
Sure.
there was debts and there was a lot of uncertainty that came through that. You know, Post COVID, we've in the past year or so, there's been a lot more interest. There's been this bill that's come through California. Colorado's doing a bit of a test as far as a very similar type of bill that they're trying to put into place around promoting positive reporting. Canada's had some, the Prime Minister of Canada even said that he wanted this to be kind of a priority. And so there's been a lot more conversation around it. And you've probably seen in some of your ads with Experian with their rent boost and like all these other products that are coming out regarding educating individuals on the importance of having credit. And as immigration becomes top of mind in more conversations, and you have students that are entering in the US trying to establish themselves for long-term careers, like it's becoming more commonplace, which means that using their rental payments to build credit is becoming more and more prominent in the conversations. On the flip side, you have a lot of the tenancy branches and tribunals that got really gunged up with COVID. There has been a lot
Mhm.
of delays and a lot of changes in legislation around how quickly you can evict some or those sorts of things, especially in places like New York and California, where it can often take a long time to get someone out that isn't paying rent. And therefore, you
Yeah.
see services like ours that allow you to report that rental payment while they're still in the house and after they move out, even without getting a judgment, as long as you're reporting according to the lease. Like that's seen an uptick in conversation as well, just because it's now becoming a more common tool that you can utilize to help protect your assets.
And it's just easier to do it now than it probably was before.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Technology is a wonderful thing, right?
Oh, it's a love-hate relationship for some, but you're right. Like,
Yeah.
because I remember years ago we talk about this, and people are like, well, how do you report it? I'm like, I don't know. Yeah, you start going the rabbit hole of Google, and it's like, well, there's this service and that service, and I'm like, I've never heard of these services.
Yeah.
And then, on the flip side, if someone does have bad credit, then I do see like Experian has like Experian Boost. I'm like, I don't know, that feels scammy. It's like if you make your payments on time, pay off debt, typically that would increase your score. Although I have seen it where I've paid off debt and my score actually went down. I'm like,
Yeah.
this is a racket.
Yeah. Credit's funny. It's,
It-
yeah.
yeah, it's like their own algorithm of like, oh, you almost like you're forced to have some level of debt,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because credit is it's a storytelling thing. Like I review applications for rentals like all the time, whether it's my own or sometimes I might be helping out a friend. But I'm like, but this doesn't tell me much because I don't know what's accurate and what isn't. Then you
Yeah.
see the credit report and the bank statements, and that tells a totally different story.
Yeah.
Totally
Yeah.
different story.
Yeah, and I mean, you would see this as well. There's been such an increase in fraudulent documents or
Hmm.
things that just are inaccurate that it's like, okay, once I actually pull information for myself, whether that's a credit file, background check, whatever, it doesn't actually match what's provided by this individual. And, you're looking at all this vast amount of information that now you start to have access to. And what we're seeing is that a lot of housing providers are having to put in like very explicit credentials that they have. I mean, you
Hmm.
mentioned not having a credit score, but like what we're hearing more and more from individuals, they'll explicitly state you must have a minimum credit score of X to help
Hmm.
that get them around any sort of discrimination law,
Right.
right? And it's not that what I'll say is like from having many conversations, vast majority of people aren't intending to be discriminatory, right?
Right.
That is a very edge case. It's the fact that you may not know the legislation around it, and so he's like, oh, I really like Rick and I pick him over somebody else. And if,
Right.
there's just challenges surrounding that. And so what we're seeing is a lot more standardization, housing providers paying for access and credit reports, background checks and things on their own, even if the tenant pays for it, like the information comes directly to the landlord property manager, they view it, they do extensive screening surrounding that individual just to make sure that it is accurate. And you're never going to always get it right, but put
Right.
your put yourself in the best position to make a good decision.
It's funny that you mention that because most of the time, not all the time, most of the time, when I see people who've had problems with tenants, I say, well, tell me about the screening. And it was either they didn't do enough screening or they made an exception.
Right.
And it's usually that exception that gets them. Like I had a client where she had bad credit and she said, "Oh, it was medical debt, things like that." And usually, my investor client, like normally he like lets that slide a little bit. He's like, "Look, medical debt happens. We get these bills that are massive. How are you supposed to pay this off?"
Yeah.
So he's like, "Look, I'll take a chance." She paid first month's deposit, stopped paying after that. Like just stopped, and then trashed the place.
Ugh,
Yeah, it was
brutal.
rough. And then he
Yeah.
calls the attorney. This was December of 2019. So it was right before COVID really hit. So luckily
Okay.
he actually got lucky, but he talks to the attorney. The attorney's like, "You're better off paying her to leave."
Yeah.
It's like, really? So he cut her a check for 500 bucks. He got off easy. Now
He
it's
did.
like 10, 20, 40, 50,000. Um, but yeah, so like something like the credit is so important.
Yeah. 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 It's the beauty of it is that it really does have benefits for both parties. It's
Exactly.
just that really small segment of the population that's intentionally not paying their rent, right? And
Right.
it's not a lot of people, but it has a really negative impact on the housing system, right?
Sure.
It impacts tenants that are good because they don't get access to the housing that they want. Rents tend to go up because the risks associated with renting are increased for investors. If housing providers that are challenged in other ways, if you can't evict someone, like you have to protect yourself in other ways. And so we're starting to see a lot of this shift that continues to occur, which is kind of why platforms like ours kind of continue to build in popularity because there is kind of that dual-sided benefit. And this challenge around housing isn't going to go away as far as
Right.
there's always some friction in the tenant landlord relationship. It doesn't have to be, but when you have someone intentionally not paying their rent, there's going to be some friction. And
Hmm.
what we try and bring into that is that it use communication that's hopefully positive and proactive with things like rent reminders, late payment notices. Hey, did you know that you haven't paid your rent? This may impact your credit. Like there's a lot of kind of these proactive steps that hopefully encourage a conversation around let's create a payment plan. If I know the rent is going to hit my credit, I'm probably going to let you know if I'm going to be late, if I'm at all responsible, right? Because you're going to want to mitigate the negative side of it as a reliable tenant, even if I might be late for a couple days in a month or something like that, right? It's just that conversation is very positive from that standpoint. And there's some individuals, of course, that don't pay rent that will have that negative impact, but
It
unfortunately,
happens.
that is the reality. Yeah.
Yeah, it's part of business, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the one thing about this that some people get really disconnected about is like when we have rentals, it's a business. I
Yeah.
understand you may have inherited the property. I understand you just moved out, like, oh, I'm just gonna rent it out. And then people get mad when there's all these protections. And I'm like, yes, some of it's excessive, but we have consumer protections on other
Yeah.
products and services, and that's what we're offering.
Yeah.
But what you brought up was interesting about, basically the conversation around credit. And I wonder if this does what I think it's intended to do, then will landlords actually loosen their guidelines on tenants because they know that there's consequences, right? So if they had a credit limit of 715, are they willing to go down to 690? It's like, look, I'm willing to forgive that because I know that I can tie it into their credit.
Would you?
Good freaking question. It would depend on why their credit score is what it is. But if it was one of those where, let's say I'm happy with the 700, someone came in with a 690, and it was more of, yeah, a few years ago, something happened, this, that, and the other, I might consider it.
Yeah.
I might. It's like, look, you know, everyone deserves a second chance, but this is my home. This is an asset that I have. I have to protect it because every time you don't pay, it means I can't put food on the table for my family. Like it works
Right.
both ways. So you have to set up for this rent payment where we report everything to the credit. So good news is probably by the time the first year is up, your credit score is probably going to be better to where it'd be acceptable anyways.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a hard maybe.
I like that.
Yeah.
Hard maybe. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, what we see is that, adjustments in any sort of screening are usually highly correlated with how quickly you can get someone out of your property.
100%.
So places like New York, I'm going to say no. This isn't going
Right.
to change. It's just another tool that prevents maybe a few people from going to collections, or just helps that accounts receivable department, whether that's you, your spouse, or you have a team of paralegals and lawyers and collectors to deal with that. But in places where I think it is a little bit quicker to get people out, like a tool like this is definitely helpful as well. It's just we're seeing that as being one of the number one things that impacts how lenient people will be on accepting individuals. And
Yeah. I remember when I was buying property in Birmingham, Alabama, and I was
mhm,
interviewing property managers. I'm like, because they basically choose the tenant for you. A lot of
right,
people don't know that. Property managers, they basically take 100% control. So I said, hey, send me your criteria. Their criteria was like the mid 500s for the credit. And at the moment, I was like, it's also Alabama. Like we ended up having to do an eviction at one point, and it took 90 days. That's
right,
better than LA. That would have taken 90 years. Like it's just, there's a big difference there. So people can be more lenient
yeah,
in other parts. I'm sure the same with like Texas. And it's like, yeah, it's 3 day
yeah,
notice, whatever. You're out in a week,
yeah,
we move on.
yeah,
And I have been seeing, because we also have property in Nashville and we have a
okay,
vacancy. And we're talking to the property manager. I'm like, what's going on? They're like, we're getting a lot of applications, but they don't meet the criteria. They have a lot of, evictions or whatever the case may be,
yeah,
So I think that having accountability, even on both ends, I think it's going to do well.
yeah.
Have you been seeing more of the prospective tenant paying versus the housing provider? Is it 50/50? I'm just kind of curious to see what you've been seeing.
Yeah, well, from the tenant screening standpoint, we're seeing a heavier shift towards applicants paying for that. So,
Sure.
you know, you didn't specifically mention that, but whether they're paying for background checks, credit checks, et cetera, that's
Hmm.
become more industry standard, especially throughout the US, where most jurisdictions allow an applicant to pay it. They might set some limits on how much you can charge it, but it really means if you're serious, you're going to pay to apply to be here. Um,
Right.
on the reporting side, given the nature of our model, where it allows you to report both positive and negative, we see a vast majority of our users where it's landlord paid.
Hmm.
And the reason being that they want the benefit of the notifications that go out. It's often the only technology platform they use to manage their properties. They
Mm.
also want the protections that come through that if the tenant stops paying, that debt would get reported. If you think if the tenant's paying and all of a sudden they stop paying with rent, and
Hmm.
they're not going to be paying for their debts to be reported to the credit bureau. So it's just not going to be a thing. So if they know they're going to stop paying rent, they stop paying for the reporting cycle, and so you don't really get the benefit of having to report those debts as the housing provider unless you're the one that's actually paying for the reporting.
So if I'm the housing provider and I'm paying for it, I would still technically need their consent, right? So they would
For the positive,
still.
yes, never for the debts, but
Never for the
yeah, for the
negatives, but for
positive,
the
yeah,
positives. But I
yeah,
think that's how
and
I would probably spin it, right? It'd be
yeah,
like a one sheet as part of the disclosures, like, hey, look, great news. There's a
yeah,
way for your credit to be even better or
yeah,
to improve. And so, we're paying for this. Um, but we do ask that it's like this stays open
yeah.
because it's just
Well,
easy.
and absolutely, absolutely. And the one caveat I'll say is that most jurisdictions within the US allow
Hmm.
the landlord property manager to pass on certain fees to the tenant. So
Sure.
even if you're paying for it, like you
Oh,
can
I
say,
see.
great, I'm going to add $5 every month to your bill, kind of like I add a garbage fee. I like there's a technology fee or
Mm.
whatever it is. And this isn't common for small landlords, but definitely for property managers. Like they're going to have a series of fees that they often charge to people. And so you can usually implement this as part of that. So it ends up costing you nothing, essentially.
Got it.
Now, I
But
say,
yeah.
yeah, I use that kind of in loose terms because it's not necessarily going to apply to everybody. And, our platform for most people is going to be $20 a month, right? Which allows you to
Mhm.
report 20 leases, as many tenants that
No.
are on the lease. So for most people, they just, you know what, I like the protection. I can write it off as a business expense. $20 a month, I'm happy with it. So, the clientele that often comes to us from the smaller independent community, most of them, the landlord will pay. They'll report their tenants. If the tenant wants to opt into positive, great. And if not, then you get the benefit of the downside protection.
You bring up something interesting. If there's more than one person on the lease that's over 18,
Yeah.
so you'd have to go in and report each individual one, right? That right in terms of like it, because what I liked about the way of like, hey, it's positive and negative, is like it's almost like it's automated,
Yeah,
with the exception you have to actively go in. So that means
yes.
you'd be setting one up for each person over the age of 18.
No, you'd actually add them all to the same lease. So,
Got it.
if you happen to move back up to San Francisco, we got a great place together, and you
Perfect.
decided to expand your real estate empire a little bit
Why
further north.
not?
Why not? Right? We are both signatories on that contract, which means we're legally
Mm,
both responsible for the entire
sure.
balance of it. On the positive side, we would both get credit for the entire amount of rent. So if our rent is $2,500, we're both going to have a trade line that shows that we paid $2,500 in rent every single month. Conversely, if you don't pay your half of the rent, it hits me too. Right. And
Sure.
so, because they're signed on a contract, it ends up having dual positive and as well as dual negative on it.
So, and I'm not sure if you know the answer to this. Let's say I have a roommate, so we're both on it,
Yeah.
and I want to go buy a house. So I guess it would still, as long as basically what I'm getting at is lenders like to look at your credit report and they want to see what debt you have. So if this is showing on your credit report, typically like, well, I'm moving out. This is no longer my responsibility. But a lender might want something in writing to that
Yeah.
effect, right?
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you've
It's
seen?
Yeah, in the US, that's very rare that we would get
Hmm.
some sort of mortgage broker thing that writes into us
Hmm.
asking for it. The reason I say that is in the US, there's actually a specific rental trade line. So they can see that that data relates to housing. And
Mm.
that it kind of goes without saying. And they usually have the conversation with individuals say, hey, I see this, trade line here that's implied to rent. Is that your current rent? Looks like it's your current rental property. I don't see any debts. Will you have that going forward? And they say no. And similar way that when you're applying for a mortgage, you typically put what your current rental amount is, right? It's just
Hmm.
it's taken in as information. I've only had to we've only had to provide a couple of those in the US,
Yeah.
and that was a few years ago when it was less prominent. But
Right.
now most housing or most mortgage underwriters will know what it is.
Yeah. So as long
Yeah.
as the roommate's okay, because if the roommate
Yeah.
stays, they might be like, oh no, I want us both on the hook.
Yeah.
But that would
Well,
happen either way, right? Like if
that's right.
they
Yeah.
stop paying, they'd both be evicted because they'd be on the lease. It wouldn't matter.
Right. I mean, this goes into kind of best practices, right? That
Correct.
if we're living together and you buy a house and move out, like you should get something from your landlord releasing you from that lease,
Right.
right? And so then the legal obligations are over, which means I'd probably enter into either a new lease to continue on, whatever that is. But that way, there's no way for them to come back at you. And that if that happened to happen and you had some sort of release or documentation, you can dispute that information and it would get removed, right? So there is protections around inaccurate information, which can happen when reporting. That
Sure.
just like anything on your credit file, you can dispute that information, and inaccuracies can get updated or removed depending on what's needed.
Yeah. I remember a few years ago when I had my identity stolen. It was
Ooh,
a nightmare.
brutal.
Yeah, actually had to call the companies and be like, no, this isn't me. I need you to take it off my credit report. Some would do it, some wouldn't. It was a
Yeah.
battle, but I was like, whatever. It happens, unfortunately. So this has been great. So tell us a little bit about your company, FrontLobby. So what is your guys' role in all of this?
Yeah. So we are a SaaS platform that allows housing providers of any size to screen tenants, meaning pull instant credit checks, as well as report rental data, both positive and negative, for current and former tenants to the credit bureaus. So we are the
Okay.
software layer that exists between the housing provider, who's the creditor, and the credit bureaus. So we allow you to take that information, standardize it, and report it to the credit bureaus. So
And it goes to all three?
that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, was there any, this has all been really good information. I really appreciate it. Because like I said, I've talked to people about this for years. And it's like, for once, they're doing something that's like mutually beneficial. So, did you have any departing words, whether it is about the assembly bill or just about this process, kind of what you see going forward?
Yeah, I'd say if you're with the assembly bill, it goes into effect on April 1st. And
Hmm.
so if you do have buildings that are over 15 units, or you're a REIT, an LLC with a corporation entity or a corporation, we've got information on our website about it. You can find some information online. Like there's some specific things that you have to do. So you can always reach out to us or kind of investigate that on your own for how to comply. But for a vast number of individuals where that isn't going to apply to them, like, the benefits of reporting rent, as you stated, are still there, right? And
Yeah.
for a lot of people, this is relatively new information, even though it's been around for several years. Um, and even things like we do have a product that allows you to report a former tenant's debt. So let's say an individual has moved out 3 years ago, they still owe you a few grand. You may or may not have gotten a judgment for it. For a one-time fee with no commission, you can also report that information to the credit bureaus through our platform. And so, there is a bunch of different tools that are at your fingertips now
Yeah.
related to credit, both positive and negative, that can really help your investors or individuals that are looking to offer housing as a way to protect them, especially in states like California, where there's becoming more and more regulations and laws, which can be positive, but it also can be confusing at times.
That's a good way to put it. It can be hard to keep up. So,
Totally.
all right. Well, thank you so much. If anyone wanted to get a hold of you, Grant, what would be the best way to do it?
Yeah, you can go to our website, which is frontlobby.com. And if you want to connect with my team, we're happy to support. So, support at frontlobby.com is the best email to reach out to us. We're happy to jump on a phone call, show the platform. We can talk through the bill if you want, kind of whatever you're looking to do, whatever your size, just reach out to us and we're happy to spark a conversation.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being here. And thank you, everyone, for listening and watching wherever you are. And I'll see you guys next week. Thank you.